How does a man kill 5 women, then get praised for turning his life around?
I've studied hundreds of criminal profiles in my life, but this one stayed with me. Not because of how he killed, but because of how he lived afterward.
Faryion Edward Wardrip murdered 5 young women in Texas between 1984 and 1986. He stalked them, strangled them, sometimes raped them. His victims were all between 20 and 25, small, light white. They reminded him of someone. That's no coincidence. It never is. He was arrested after the last murder, confessed over the phone, and was sentenced to 35 years. He served 11 years. He walked out, got a job, joined a church, became a youth mentor, married again, spoke at Christian retreats, praised for redemption. All while a thin black bracelet, the ankle monitor, hummed beneath his pants leg. A quiet reminder that monsters don't always vanish. Sometimes they pretend to be healed. In 1999, forensic DNA cracked the lies. They dug deeper and the facade crumbled. He didn't just slip up. He never stopped being who he was. And that brings us to the question that keeps me awake. How many people like him are walking free? Because no one ever looked closely enough.
Not all monsters grow up in cages. Some grow up quietly.
Faryion was born in 1959 in Indiana. Nothing stood out in the police files. No bloody childhood. No burned animals. No missing neighbors. That's what makes this more haunting. He wasn't loud. He wasn't violent. He was invisible. His parents weren't cruel, but they weren't warm either. I imagine a house with clean carpets and silent dinners, a place where emotions weren't allowed to spill, where anger simmered beneath the surface but was never named. Some psychologists call it insecure avoidant attachment, when a child learns early that expressing pain won't bring comfort. So he bottles it up until it starts to ferment. Wardrip had issues with anger. Not explosive at first, but restrained, calculated. By the time he was a teen, the signs were there. He didn't know how to talk about his rage, so he turned it inward. Or worse, stored it. When I look back, I picture a small boy sitting cross-legged in a clean bedroom. On the shelf, a teddy bear with a missing eye. Torn, stitched back together. Too neat for a child's toy, like someone tried to fix the damage, but didn't know how. The police never looked in that room. But I do. Not because I need evidence, but because that's where the first fracture always lives. Not in a scream, but in the silence after. Somewhere in that little boy's mind, a voice had already started whispering, "No one will ever understand you, so take what you want."
Being invisible is a slow death most kids survive. He didn't.
Faryion Wardrip went to school like every other boy, but that's where the similarities ended.
He was quiet, awkward, and never quite fit in. Not in class, not in sports, not even in line at the lunch counter. Teachers didn't remember him. Classmates barely noticed him. The ones who did usually laughed.
Children can be brutal in the most ordinary ways. They don't need to punch you to make you bleed. A look of disgust, a whisper behind your back, an empty seat no one fills. And for someone already emotionally sealed off, that's a dangerous cocktail. This is where early social trauma sets in. It's not the kind of trauma that leaves bruises, it's the kind that warps identity. When a child is constantly ignored, belittled, or made to feel unworthy, the brain starts reshaping to match that script. Faryion began to withdraw deeper, but not just out of shyness. He was building an internal narrative, one where he was superior to the people around him. A classic example of what psychologists call a narcissistic defense, when a person covers deep shame with fantasies of power. The world didn't see him, so he started dreaming of ways to make them. I imagine him sitting in the back of a math class staring out the window while everyone else solved equations. Not stupid, not lazy, just elsewhere. And that's when hatred becomes a seed. Small, hard, but waiting. He didn't just want to escape that world. He wanted to come back one day and make it pay for forgetting him. Puberty didn't awaken desire. It awakened the need to possess. As Faryion entered adolescence, something shifted. Not a bright hormonal explosion like most teens, but a quiet corrosion. He started drinking, using drugs, getting into trouble. Not wild chaos, but patterns of control masked as rebellion. He became jealous in relationships, obsessive, even paranoid. He didn't just want affection, he demanded obedience. That's a subtle but critical distinction. People often confuse early controlling behavior with passion. He must love me, they say. But what's actually happening is emotional fusion. The fear of abandonment becomes so loud that the only relief is control. This is classic borderline and antisocial overlap, craving connection but destroying it at the same time. Wardrip couldn't tolerate emotional independence. If a woman had her own thoughts, her own space, her own desires, it felt like betrayal. So he punished, with silence, with threats, with withdrawal.
He wasn't violent yet, but inside he was rehearsing.
Somewhere in those teenage years, Faryion developed what Freud called projection, the unconscious act of blaming others for your own unacceptable feelings. If he felt rage or lust, he accused her of flirting. If he fantasized about control, he said she was manipulative. And the scariest part, he believed it. There's no record of therapy, no teachers intervening, no friends who got close enough to notice. By the time he reached his 20s, he had perfected a distorted logic. Love means ownership. If she leaves, I am nothing. And if I am nothing, then she must be punished. He didn't want a partner. He wanted a reflection that obeyed.
He learned to mimic emotion like a language he never spoke.
By his mid-20s, Faryion had learned something most people never need to how to pass as normal.
He worked regular jobs, married, had a child, went to church, shook hands at grocery stores. On the outside, he was just another quiet man trying to make it.
But inside, nothing. There's a condition in psychology we call affective shallowness, a trait often found in people with high-functioning antisocial personalities. They don't feel emotions the way others do, but they know how to perform them, like an actor rehearsing a role until the audience believes. Faryion was a gifted mimic. He knew when to laugh, when to cry, when to fold his hands in prayer and say Amen, but it was all borrowed, empty. He wasn't trying to belong. He was trying to hide.
And yet people liked him. That's the chilling part. He came across as harmless, even charming, and the more invisible his inner world became, the more committed he was to the mask.
This is what we call compensatory adaptation, when someone builds an entire social persona to hide the abyss underneath. It's not always malicious. Sometimes it's pure survival. But in Faryon's case, it was strategic. He used faith, family, and familiarity as camouflage. Even after his first arrest, after years in prison, he managed to re-enter society as a model man. Spoke at church events, served in soup kitchens. People called him reformed. But here's the thing about masks: wear them long enough and they start to breathe for you.
So I ask,
is evil more dangerous when it knows how to pretend? She left him, but in his mind, she had to pay. There's always a final crack, a moment when the mask can no longer hold the weight underneath. For Faryion Wardrip, it came wrapped in rejection.
His marriage was already crumbling. Fights, silence, resentment.
Then the final insult: she left. But Wardrip didn't just see a breakup. He saw annihilation. When your entire identity is built around controlling someone, their independence feels like a personal attack. It wasn't grief he felt, it was fury, cold and consuming. Psychologists often describe this as narcissistic injury, when someone with a fragile ego experiences rejection not as loss, but as humiliation. And humiliation breeds vengeance.
He looked at his ex-wife and didn't just see betrayal.
He saw an enemy who needed to be erased. That's where the pattern began. All 5 of his victims shared one key trait: they resembled her. Petite, young, white, independent. Women who moved freely through the world and whose very freedom triggered something primitive in him.
His first murder came on December 21st, 1984. Tony Gibbs, 23 years old, a nurse, found strangled. No witnesses, no reason, just gone.
Wardrip didn't lash out in a drunken frenzy. He stalked, waited, chose. That's what makes it different. That's what makes it so cold. This wasn't passion, it was correction. And with her body still cooling on the roadside, he walked away feeling lighter.
He didn't cry. He didn't panic.
He went home, slept, woke up,
and made coffee.
Murder didn't thrill him. It quieted something inside.
Some killers shake, some vomit, some cry after the first time, but Faryion Wardrip.
He felt still. That's something few people understand. For certain personalities, those with deep internal chaos, violence doesn't cause panic. It brings clarity. In that moment, everything becomes simple. Quiet. Psychology calls it emotional regulation through domination, using control over others as a way to manage one's own distress. That's what the murder did for him. Not pleasure, not revenge, but stillness.
It gave shape to the mess inside.
Faryion later said when asked about his killings that he felt in control for once. That phrase is important. It reveals a mind desperate to feel powerful because everywhere else in life he felt small. The women weren't chosen randomly, they were proxies. Each one a silent mirror held up to his worst fears: rejection, loss, powerlessness. He didn't mutilate. He didn't prolong the agony. He wasn't interested in torture.
He wanted erasure, quiet, submission, total silence. And after he killed, he didn't flee. He didn't confess. He didn't spiral. He simply resumed his life. That's the mark of a high-functioning psychopath. No guilt, no internal punishment. Just a clean psychological slate.
He killed again weeks later. And again. Each one smoother than the last. Each one cleaner. I imagine him sitting in his car afterward. Window cracked, cigarette lit, the hum of the highway outside. And inside, for the first time, he felt like a god. After the first, it didn't feel like murder. It felt like routine. Once someone like Faryion crosses that line, there's no going back. Not because they're chased by guilt, but because they've found a rhythm that works. Between late 1984 and mid-1986, Wardrip killed at least 5 women. Some were raped, all were strangled or stabbed. The victims varied in circumstance, but not in type. They were young, small, alone, just like her, the one who walked away. This wasn't rage-fueled frenzy. It was targeted erasure. Each act soothed the same old wound, the one from childhood, from rejection from the mirror that wouldn't reflect who he needed to be. In modern psychology, we call this compulsive reenactment. It's when a person repeats the same damaging behavior over and over, not for thrill, but to resolve an internal conflict. Faryion was trying to undo something, rewrite his humiliation, and with every victim, he got better at it. He learned how to smile at the gas station clerk minutes after dumping a body, how to answer the door when the police came by, how to live in plain sight, a technique we now associate with organized killers. But there were moments in between, quiet spells. That's where the depression crept in. Not sadness over what he'd done, but a hollow ache that it didn't last. The control always faded. The stillness always broke.
And when it did, he'd start watching again, waiting, rehearsing.
Until he found her, and strangled her, and felt peace. For the first time, he felt free. Even a mask eventually crumbles under time and evidence. Faryion Wardrip might have gotten away with it forever if science hadn't caught up. After his release from prison in 1997, he wore the mask tighter than ever, married again, attended church, served coffee at community events. People praised his transformation.
But underneath the past was still bleeding.
In 1999, a DNA breakthrough linked him to the unsolved murder of Deborah Taylor. That single match unraveled everything. Investigators reopened the old files. One by one, the women's names came back. Their stories, their deaths. And Faryon's calm began to crack. He confessed over the phone, not with sobs, not with resistance, just a statement. Cold, measured. In the interrogation room, he didn't plead. He didn't shake. He sat hands folded like someone waiting for communion. That's how deeply the mask had fused with the man. And yet when you watch the footage there's something missing behind his eyes. Not rage, not remorse, just nothing. This is what we call affective flattening, a reduced ability to feel or express genuine emotion. It's often seen in those with severe antisocial traits, not because they're holding back, but because there's simply nothing left to give. The ankle monitor he wore as a free man became a symbol, not of redemption, but of delay, a silent echo of what the system failed to see. And now, as he sits on death row, I wonder, is the man in that cell really Wardrip? Or just the mask, finally still?
A reformed man with 5 ghosts strapped to his ankle.
This story doesn't start with murder. It starts with silence. We like to believe evil announces itself, that it storms into a room snarling easy to spot, but most of the time it walks quietly, smiles, holds a Bible, fills out timesheets. Faryion Wardrip wasn't a monster from birth. He was a boy no one listened to, a student no one noticed, a husband no one understood, but none of that excuses what he became.
It explains it.
And if we want to prevent the next Wardrip, we need to stop waiting for bodies to show up. His story is a textbook lesson in unrecognized pathology, how early emotional neglect, unmanaged anger, and compulsive control can build a perfect storm. He showed signs affective coldness, obsessive jealousy, shallow remorse, projection, even possible PTSD from his own suppressed childhood trauma. But we didn't name those things then. Instead, we let him wear the mask and praised him for it. What if someone had asked better questions at school? What if someone had probed deeper during his first arrest? What if we understood that some people don't need a second chance, they need real accountability before the damage multiplies?
He said it himself. They would have found me sooner if they had paid attention.
And that quote stays with me, because it's not just a confession, it's a warning.
There are more like him.
Men walking the streets, smiling at barbecues, hugging their kids, wearing masks so tight we call them reformed. But somewhere beneath a church pew, behind a locked garage door, or under the flicker of a living room lamp, they're waiting. And if we keep looking away, we won't see them until it's far too late.